Good evening. My name is Will Schneider, and I'm an assistant professor at the School of Social Work. I'm excited to have this opportunity to share a bit about myself and my research. My work examines the influence of family structure, poverty, and inequality on child well-being and child maltreatment. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and went to the University of Michigan for college. At Michigan, I majored in political science and met my wife, Andrea. We now have 2 young children, and Andrea is an assistant university counsel here at Illinois. I worked for a few years after college at Princeton and Columbia universities on research projects related to parenting and child well-being. My parents were both professors of sociology and psychology, and my brother is a professor of sociology. And so I decided I would buck tradition and get my PhD in social work. And luckily, it was the right choice. I enrolled at the Columbia University School of Social Work and quickly found a passion for research on the prevention of child maltreatment. After a postdoctoral fellowship at Northwestern, I was thrilled to be offered a position here at Illinois. The School of Social Work here has been one of the pioneers in child welfare research, undertaking work that led to guardianship and foster care, and today helping to train the state's Child Protective Service workers. I've also come to know a number of undergraduates who went through the foster care system in Illinois and are now studying to become social workers themselves. And having students like these and others who have experienced disadvantage adds so much to the classroom experience. So people generally know that child maltreatment is bad, but few are aware of the lifelong effects it has on children. Mental health problems, cognitive difficulties, worse physical health, decreased earnings, and increased involvement in the criminal justice system. As my colleague Dr. Hyunil Kim here at Illinois has found, in the US about 37% of children will be the subject of a child maltreatment allegation by the time they turn 18. And the estimated lifetime cost of child maltreatment is about $821,000 per child. As you can see, child maltreatment is a pervasive problem in the United States. It cuts across racial and ethnic lines, and while the prevalence varies by state, nearly 1 in 100 children are affected. This is a staggering number of children. In Illinois, over 146,000 children received an investigation for possible child maltreatment in 2018. Child maltreatment falls into 3 main categories: sexual abuse, physical abuse, and neglect. Child abuse is often defined as an act of commission, or an intentional act by a parent or guardian that physically harms a child. Child neglect is an act of omission, or a failure to act that results in imminent harm or endangers a child. Neglect accounts for about 75% of all child maltreatment, while abuse accounts for about 20%. And so there are many types of child neglect, but I'm going to focus on 2 of the most common forms: physical and supervisory neglect. So here you can think of a family living in dangerous or substandard housing, or a mother who has no other option but to leave her child in the car so she can work her shift and not lose her job. The last 30 years have been marked by stark differences in the trends for child abuse and child neglect. Rates of abuse have declined drastically, but rates of neglect have remained steadily high. So my research is focused on this puzzle. Why has child abuse declined while child neglect has remained largely unchanged? For the last few years, my colleagues and I have been trying to put together the pieces. For the first 200 years of this country, no formal child welfare system existed. In fact, societies to prevent cruelty to animals were created before societies to protect children. However, in 1974, Congress passed the Child Abuse Protection and Treatment Act, or CAPTA. Importantly, the act was premised on the idea that child maltreatment stems from parental psychopathology, from depression, stress, emotional problems, and character defects that could be treated by mental health interventions. And so one possibility for why child abuse has declined is that it can be effectively treated by mental health interventions or parent education programs. But child neglect does not seem to respond to these interventions. And this may be because it is more closely tied to poverty than mental health problems or parenting decisions. And this is a problem because nearly all the funding for the prevention of child maltreatment stems from CAPTA, which, for largely political reasons, doesn't acknowledge poverty as a potential determinant of neglect. And so my colleagues and I have been investigating whether there is a causal connection between poverty and child maltreatment, and whether this might help to explain the diverging trends in abuse and neglect over the last 30 years. But this is a bit hard to do, because you can't randomly assign some families to be advantaged and others to be disadvantaged. So instead, we've drawn on a series of natural experiments where there's an outside to families. For example, in a series of studies, we drew on survey data of low-income families to examine how the Great Recession, measured by local unemployment rates and consumer confidence, influenced the risk for child maltreatment. Spanking, and particularly harsh and frequent spanking, is a known risk factor for child maltreatment. And we found that the recession was associated with dramatic increases in high-frequency spanking, as well as increases in the risk for abuse and neglect. We've also drawn on administrative child welfare data from about 3/4 of the counties in the US that we linked to local and state minimum wage laws. What we find is that over the last decade, increases in the minimum wage have been associated with decreases in the likelihood of child maltreatment. We've also looked at what it means to grow up in a county with high or low economic mobility. What we find is a story that we call the power of hope. That is, that growing up in an area of high economic mobility is associated with a decrease in the likelihood of physical neglect. But it turns out that it's not just being disadvantaged that influences the risk for child maltreatment. Feeling disadvantaged, or like you're doing worse than others, may also play a role. In other work, we have investigated whether objective measures of inequality, income and education, and subjective measures, social class and perceived relative income, are differently associated with approval of spanking. We found that for white, but largely not black parents, subjective measures, feeling like you were doing worse than others, were associated with approval of spanking. This association was restricted just to fathers, but being a member of a labor union entirely buffered this link. This work indicates that it's not just poverty that influences maltreatment, but the subjective feeling of doing worse than others that plays a role as well. Our findings point to the need to shift resources so that child welfare services are more closely linked with existing social welfare programs. By integrating existing social welfare programs and prioritizing child maltreatment prevention, we can reduce the flow of families who come into contact with child protective services for needs that are really income-based. Under this design, a child wouldn't be removed from a family because they lived in substandard or dangerous housing. Instead, they would be linked to housing assistance and other supports, fully integrated with other services. I'm optimistic about the ability of social work, research, and society to take on this problem. Illinois has historically played a large role in shaping our understanding of child maltreatment, and I believe that we can alter the trajectory of generations of children to come. Thank you.